This week, we're going to look at Chapter 4, the rhetorical shaping of gender, competing images of men. Now, when we look at the men's movements, they are diverse, they have political goals and strategies, and they are constantly evolving, new ones rising periodically. But since the 1980s, the explosion of research on cultural shaping of masculinity has increased, and universities have begun sort of offering men's studies in their universities. Men have been less involved in the women's movements to change images of their own gender, often because they're not as generally as targeted for gender discrimination or disadvantaged by in the same way that women have. Now, some men's groups work to provide new images of masculinity, and some work to safeguard the increase in men's privileges. Like women's movements, men's groups are constantly evolving with new groups arising. There's no single agenda or viewpoint that exists unifying all men's groups. Now, some men's groups are allied with feminist organizations, liberal branches, while other groups, they work to safeguard and increase men's privileges and rejecting feminism. Masculinity has been an increasingly popular area of study since the 80s, and men have been both in support of and in opposition to women's movements, and their movements have often begun in response to women's movements. So let's look at some general categories of men's groups. We're going to check out the pro-feminist groups, the masculinists men groups, and we'll look at a more contemporary men's movement. Now, rhetorical, in case you're wondering, rhetorical is really just a persuasive argument. And so when we look at, as in this week, the men's movements, and next week we're going to look at the women's movements, when we see in the title the rhetorical persuasion or rhetorical, arguments, or the rhetorical, what we're meaning is these persuasive arguments that are used to defend a side or to make a point. And so these are the persuasive arguments that men have used for, masculinity and promoting, or for the, if you will, argument for why women's movements have been disadvantaging men. And so it's their strength of argument. Now, you may agree with it and you may disagree with it. And in gender studies, it's not about what you agree with as much as you have a foundation behind what you believe in. And so this is the beginning of looking at a chapter which will start looking at rhetorical or strength of arguments that may or may not resonate with you. And in this course, you're not judged on what resonates with you, but you are looking at and will be given the opportunity to explore all these different areas of gender and see what resonates with you, what the evidence has been saying, where the research and the persuasive arguments are, and if you disagree, then what is your persuasive argument against? Explore, have fun, and let's see where this leads us. Pro-feminist men's groups. Now, they're also known as progressive men or male feminists. Now, this movement, it began in the 60s. Now, the 60s, as we'll see in next week's chapter on the women's movements, was the second wave of the women's movement. And as men faced the sexism presented in the new left group, the new left groups like, now I'm going to give you, this is also in your textbook, the SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the SDS, Students for the Democratic Society. Now remember, this is a very volatile period in the 60s where there were a lot of different movements. You might remember about, the hippies and the anti-establishment groups and the women's movements, and still with the rising of the black support groups. So there was a lot going on in this time. And they generally associated themselves with liberal feminism, that men and women are basically alike and should be treated equally. They were working hard at bringing attitudes and behaviors in line with an egalitarian ideology. So, and as a way of explaining, the way that society generally has been seen to be set up is what is known as patriarchy, where men tend to have the authority and women tend to be less in that position. The families were set up that way. Men had traditionally been head of the family, the breadwinner, and women had not been. They'd been supporting the family. And so there had been this inequity, not just in the home, but in society generally. Men were in positions of authority when it came to the law. They were police officers, they were judges, they were lawyers, they were heads of businesses, they were the political leaders. And women typically were not. And so this is an example of how it was a patriarchy society. Now, there are alternatives. There is what's known as a matriarchy. Now, this isn't generally seen in very many places in the world in human society. You find this within elephants. That's the matriarch, or the women who are the leaders of the pack, if you will. But what they were looking for was not to change patriarchy into matriarchy. They were looking at what is known as egalitarianism, which is the equal distribution of authority and influence, and that both men and women are equitable. They need each other's capacity, and that if women given the same opportunities as men would benefit society and would benefit families and would benefit. And so the focus of being egalitarian ideology was not just that of women, but it became a part of what men were experiencing. They were ashamed when confronted with this hypocrisy. So the pro-feminists were supporting women's battles for equitable treatment, and they had some things that they were predominantly endorsing. Now, one would have been equal pay for equal work, hiring and promoting women, increasing in parental leave, and affordable child care. So these were very important elements to pro-feminists. They were, of course, parts of the feminist movement and what they were strongly endorsing. And so the pro-feminists were adopting some of the similar perspectives. Now, this wasn't all happening in Canada and the United States at the same time, although some of it was. And so your textbook takes a particularly American slant. But these were happening in Canada, but maybe not quite as boisterously as it might have been in the United States. Now, some pro-feminists perform what they call the traitorous identity. And basically, this is is when a man who is a member of a group challenges particular attitudes or actions that may be common and accepted among members of that group. Now, for example, perhaps you're in a group of your friends and someone starts to tell a sexist joke, that the traitorous identity would stand up and say to his friends in that group and criticize the commonly accepted attitude and actions and engage in a personal dialogue. It's not always easy, but this is what many pro-feminist men would do in adopting this traitorous identity, was in a way of infiltrating, if you will, and persuading men that they are part of the problem when it comes to a number of issues like domestic violence and like supporting the patriarchal perspective. So pro-feminists wanted to develop the emotional capacities that society had discouraged from men. Men had long time been expected to, don't cry, big boys don't cry, and be stoic and quieten your emotions. Emotions are for women, not for men. And so this pro-feminist group were starting to challenge these sorts of attitudes and actions that may be more common and accepted among members of they wanted to encourage men to be more sensitive, caring, open, and engage in meaningful relationships with others. And so through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, even a good chunk of the 60s and the 70s, and even into the 80s, there was this very strong men don't cry, men don't express emotions, men just do things. They don't think about what they do, they don't emote. And of course, we know that's not really the way that is. Men are just as capable of an emotional expression as are women. And so, for example, my father, later in his life, much after his retirement, started to reach out and connect in more meaningful ways with his children, and more specifically with his grandchildren. It was like he had become okay, that the societal pressure to be unemotive and disconnected somewhat from your family at times, had drifted away, and it was almost like he had permission to engage and care more deeply. Now, he's 84 now, and I think that really enriched who he felt he was and how he connected with his family. So let's look at some of the organizations and movements supporting anti-violence and pro-feminist view. If we look at some of these different organizations, one that stands out as being one of the first larger ones is the National Organization for Men Against Sexism, NOMAS. Now, it has a male feminist organization that sponsors workshops, speakers, and annual conferences, increases men's awareness of options for emotional expression, and ending men's violence, and developing pro-feminist studies, and supporting education against homophobia. This is just a screenshot of their website. Now, they have four main areas in which they focus on. One is the reorganizing and resisting of masculine power and privilege. They see it as being an issue. They see it as being what affects what women are capable of doing, and this is not something that benefits men any more than it benefits women. They look at ending of violence against women. They see this as being not just a women's issue, but a men's issue, because it's men who are violent against women. So men need to be retrained, if you will, and reestablish relationships with women in a more positive manner. Ending homophobia and its associated violence. Needing to be able to look at and see people as people and not judge them based on their orientation. A person is a person. And enriching men's studies. Now, this wasn't enriching men's studies in order to establish male power and masculine privilege, but to look at what are the things that have influenced where men have come to today, and why, what are the things that they can do, and why did that continue, and what influences might there be to change how we see who men are. Now, there are other groups, many other groups. Now, one group that emerged in the 1987 in New York is one that's known as ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Now, this was established back in '87, around about the height of the AIDS epidemic and how it was being portrayed in that period of time. And they fought for more positive medical treatment and for changes in societal view about HIV and AIDS, that it wasn't just a homosexual issue, but in fact it was a wider issue than that. Much of their work in the early years was challenging the beliefs and the inaccurate depictions of HIV and AIDS, and the people who were affected. Now, it was interesting because I can remember back in this time, and certainly earlier in the '80s, where any contact with a person with HIV and AIDS was discouraged. Don't touch anything that they've touched. Don't touch them. You might get it. And so groups like ACT UP and others were aiming to try to reorganize this, because the research was not supporting that. And so part of this strength of this group, if you will, was that they chose leaderless democratic strategies, which really encouraged participation. There wasn't a person who stood up and led everybody. Everybody took a part. Now, another group of pro-feminist organized men's groups are what are known as the men's anti-violence groups. These groups see violence against women as a men's issue, since most violence against women are enacted by men. And they reason that violence against women, not just women's issue, because the majority of violence against women is enacted by men, therefore prevention of violence is a men's issue. Now, one of the groups that that's one of the largest groups, came out of Canada in 1991, and it's known as the White Ribbon Campaign. And you might be familiar with that. When around November 25th to December 6th, white ribbons are disseminated around. You can donate to the campaign. And this was in response to the 14 women that were shot down and massacred in Montreal in an engineering department in class. So this is the White Ribbon Campaign. It's an international organization founded in Canada by two men, men committed to ending violence against women, and its
the largest anti-violence group in the world. Members wear white ribbons between November 25th and December 6th as a symbol of their opposition to violence against women. The White Ribbon Campaign members present workshops within their communities that demonstrate violence, including physical violence, emotional violence, and sexual harassment, is generally committed by men and encourage men in attendance to take responsibility for stopping it and speaking out. Now, the White Ribbon Campaign emphasizes that they are not male bashers by acknowledging that the majority of men are not violent. Now, this group works to support women's groups and activism. Now, some of the critics of the White Ribbon Campaign argue that it doesn't go far enough in its analysis, that the problem is not a few violent men, these critics argue, but that the way in which men and masculinity are defined and formed in contemporary societies. Now, another group that you've probably seen at some point, if you've lived in a city anywhere, is what's known as the Walk a Mile in Her Shoes. And it was formed in California in 2001, and it focuses on men. To encourage more men to get involved in anti-violence work, this group organizes events where men wear high heels and march through local streets. The sort of adage is, first you walk the walk, then you talk the talk. Another group that has emerged is what's known as the Mentors in Violence Prevention, MVP. It's an educational program founded by Jackson Katz that seeks to teach men about the ways in which aggression and violence are closely linked to cultural views of masculinity and are routine parts of their socialization, that is, the socialization of men. MVP focuses on the roles of normative masculinity and the ways in which violence is seen as a normal part of manhood in our society. MVP emphasizes the role of the bystander behavior, or how those who are aware of violence respond to it. MVP states that men must take personal responsibility to stop violence, both not committing it and by refusing to condone it or allow other men's violence. And so it's these groups that are pro-feminist in large part are aiming to do what they can to, if you will, re-socialize who men have often been viewed, have had to view themselves, or have been taught, if you will, socialization. Now, we're going to get into that chapter a bit. We're going to talk about socialization quite a bit more as this semester unrolls. And socialization really is the role of parents, society, media, education that has on giving all, both men and women, the messages of what it is to be masculine and feminine. And these pro-feminist groups feel that the messages that men have received has been what has promoted some of this violence against women and other inequities that occur. So let's move on and see what other groups can look like. And we're going to move into what are known as the masculinists men's movement. Now, this is a different group. It's a group that doesn't look at being pro-feminist, and they don't, in some cases, even accept it. They are riling against it, if you will. It's also known as pro-masculine movements. These groups believe that men are the objects of gender disadvantage and discrimination, and that masculinity needs to be reclaimed. They are positioned against feminism and against pro-feminists. Now, men's rights groups or men's rights activists, their goal is to restore traditional roles for men and women and enjoy the privilege that men have historically enjoyed. They wish to regain their control as the head of the family, but believe their superiority to women should be associated with their ability to fill the traditional breadwinner role. So they're looking for things to fall back to the way things have been. They don't think that the changes that have been emerging as a result of feminism and pro-feminism is doing anything positive for men. Now, one of the more extreme versions of these men's rights groups are what are known as the Freemen. And it's an example of an extreme men's rights activist group. They believe that women have more power than men and that men face greater discrimination, and emphasize the burden of the provider role, the breadwinner, if you will, that role, on men, and aim to restore pride in traditional masculine, and in brackets here I'm saying, macho qualities like toughness, ruggedness, invulnerability, and self-reliance. Now, this is a small group, but these are the sorts of groups that do start to emerge over time in response often to women's groups. Now, father rights groups, these groups state that the court discriminates against men by assuming that women should be the primary parents. The most high-profile fathers' rights group is Fathers for Justice, which relies on dramatic stunts and uses humor to draw attention to the issue. Now, many class action suits have been filed in the United States, and they have also been filed in Canada, arguing that fathers have constitutional, no, in Canada it's not a constitutional right per se, to be parents, and are thus guaranteed at least 50% shared custody. Now, the difference between the U.S. and Canada on this issue is in Canada, in family court, the court is interested in the best care and welfare of the children. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the breadwinner. It means who the child or the children will be best served to grow up together with. And so in Canada, these fathers' rights groups think that oftentimes that it favors women and that men are having to pay for that court decision. And so some of these groups tend to take a perspective that makes it appear as if men are disadvantaged, where in a lot of cases, and many cases, the reason that the children are with mothers for the most part is the kind of care that they can and do receive in that family dynamic. Now, another group that falls into this sort of masculinist men's group is what is known as the Mythopoetic men's group. Now, Mythopoetic was founded by Robert Bly, and it aims to foster men's personal growth and rediscovery the deep mythic roots of masculine thinking and feelings to restore spiritual, emotional, and intellectual wholeness. The ideal masculine role existed during ancient times in the Middle Ages, when men were self-confident, strong, and emotionally live and sensitive. The ideal masculine role and men's connection to the work and the earth were disrupted during the Industrial Revolution, modernization, and feminism. So when men began working outside the home, young boys lost fathers who could initiate them into manhood and teach them to relate spiritually and emotionally to other men. Now, Bly's term he used was called father hunger, and it described the grief experienced by modern men born from the yearning to be close to their own fathers and other men. So the movement has received praise for identifying and highlighting the anguish men may feel because of a distant relationship with their father, but has been criticized for being unwilling to confront other issues of gender inequality for their participation in sustaining that inequality. Now, although prior to it was very popular through the 1980s and some of the 90s, this movement has largely been declining, with only a few active groups and a few new members. They'd spend quite a bit of time out in the woods, sort of bonding with men, reclaiming their sort of spirit of what it is to be a man pre-industrial era. Now, another big group in the States, and these next two groups really haven't found their way into Canada. One is known as the Promise Keepers, and it was founded by Bill McCartney and Dave Wardle, and is based on an evangelistic Christianity and preaches that men should use God's commandments as guides to understand the responsibility they hold as men. Now, based on Christian imperatives, men are required to be good husbands, fathers, and members of the community. The movement urges men to be leaders in their family, to reflect the God-given division of labor between men and women. Promise Keepers urge men to rely on other men instead of women, believing that men can hold each other accountable in ways that women cannot. Now, Promise Keepers have been criticized for their exclusion of women from their meetings and the rejection of homosexual men. They have also been charged with elitism based on a membership that mostly consists of white, middle, and upper-class men. In response to the movement has attempted to recruit more racially diverse members. It's elected an African-American president of their group, and they've also softened their rhetoric about husbands leading wives. Currently, the movement has experienced a steep decline in membership, but is trying to reinvigorate itself through international expansion. Now, another group that falls in the same masculinist groups, and you may have heard of this one or heard of this one, it's called the Million Man March. And this was founded by Louis Farrakhan out of the United States and the Reverend Benjamin Chavis Jr., aimed at bringing black men together to pledge themselves to spiritual transformation and political action. The first march was held in 1995, and it's been an annual gathering since. Men are asked to register to vote, fight drugs in their lives and in their communities, stand against unemployment and violence, and recommit themselves to their wives, families, communities, and their churches. The Million Man March has been praised as a positive, uplifting movement for black men, and it's been criticized for excluding women and for encouraging black men to focus on their rage on themselves instead of on the larger system of inequity, for being anti-feminist and anti-gay, and for holding overly conservative views of the family and of women. Sorry if I mispronounce his name, Farrakhan created the Million Man movement to respond to some of these criticisms. The group defines itself as an ongoing movement rather than an annual event, and includes all sexes, races, and sexualities. The Million Man More movement, this is the alternative to the Million Man movement, focuses on community development, social and political change, and spiritual and educational growth. Now, as you can see, there's quite a difference between the masculinist groups and the pro-feminist group. Now, these have some of their experiences in, from the 60s through the 70s and into the 80s. This next group is a more contemporary group. This is known as the Good Men Project, and it serves to start a national conversation about what does it mean to be a good man today. The goal of the organization is not to dictate what it means to be good, but to help men formulate their own definitions based on men's stories and experiences. The organization's publication allows men to express themselves without fear of judgment. However, many women also tend to read the magazines in hopes to better understanding men's lives, because a lot of the magazines that are out there that look at men aren't necessarily a particularly good model, and they're hoping that this might be an example of something to sort of have the conversation of what it is to be a good man. Okay, now what I'm hoping that we'll do, and hope you'll get out of this, is to see there isn't just one perspective about men looking at men's issues, that these issues are quite broad and even quite opposite. And when we move into the women's group, we're going to see that sort of shift as well, and that variation, and there isn't just one way to approach men's and women's issues. All right, so let's carry on the good fight, and we'll see you in week 5. Bye now.